He sat in the last pew every single time, and I never once saw him pray. I want you to hold that sentence in your mind for a moment, because everything that follows, every conversation, every letter pulled from a dusty archival drawer, every quiet revelation that changed my understanding of my own family, all of it flows from that single observation. An old man, a worn leather portfolio resting across his knees. The same seat in the back corner of St. Asaph Cathedral, beneath the shadows cast by a stone pillar that has stood in this part of North Wales since the 12th century. And he would sit there with the patience of someone who had been waiting a very long time for something he was not entirely certain would arrive. My name is Gwendolyn Hughes. I am 79 years old. I was born and raised in the valley below the Clwydian Range, and I have spent the better part of my life inside the walls of that cathedral, first as a child attending Sunday services with my parents, then as a young woman learning the mechanics of pipe organs at my father's side, and eventually as someone who devoted her professional life to building and restoring those instruments, to understanding the precise relationship between a craftsman's hand and the voice of the sacred. I retired at 68, and I thought I understood, truly understood, what it means to know a place so deeply that its silences are as familiar as its music. I was wrong about that. I know that now. The evening I'm going to tell you about began in October, on a Tuesday, with the kind of sky that Wales does particularly well in autumn, low and grey and full of the smell of wet stone and distant rain, the hills to the east barely visible through a gauze of mist. I had driven up Upper Denbigh Road in my old Vauxhall to collect my granddaughter Catherine from her evening rehearsal. Catherine is 34 years old, and she directs the adult choir at the cathedral with a gentleness and a musical intelligence that still makes my chest swell with something I can only call astonishment when I watch her work. She is not my granddaughter by blood alone. She is my granddaughter by choice, by years of shared music, by the particular intimacy that forms between two people who both understand that a sustained chord, held at precisely the right moment, can say more than a month of ordinary conversation. I had parked in my usual spot. I had walked through the west door, nodding to the carved stonework I knew by heart, feeling the temperature drop the way it always does when you pass from the Welsh autumn into the cool interior of a building that was designed centuries ago to feel eternal. I had expected to find the choir mid-rehearsal, Katrine at the front with her hands moving through the air, her voice occasionally dropping into a single note to anchor a section that was drifting. I had expected the comfortable, orderly sound of adult voices learning to breathe together. Instead, I found the rehearsal ending early. Katrine was standing very still at the front of the nave, and the choir members were gathering their coats and bags with the slightly confused energy of people released before they expected to be. And in the back pew, in the last row beneath the shadow of the stone pillar, a man sat entirely alone with a leather portfolio across his knees and his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. That is when I felt it. Something small and cold moving through me. Not fear exactly. Something older than fear. Recognition without a name. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to stop here just for one moment and say something to you, whoever you are watching this tonight. Whether you are in Cardiff or in Conwy, in London, or in some small town in the American Midwest, where a Welsh grandmother's voice is the last thing you expected to hear on a Tuesday evening. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I read every single one. And if it is late where you are, tell me that too, because something tells me this story is the kind that people find in the quiet hours. If it is reaching you somewhere, leave a like. Subscribe if you have not yet, because there is a new story here every single day. And now, let me go back to that cathedral, because what happened next is the thing I have been trying to understand for months. Catherine came to me immediately once she saw me standing at the west end of the nave. She took my arm in both of her hands the way she has done since she was small, a habit that never left her when she grew up, and she steered me gently toward the side aisle. Her voice was low, composed because Catherine is always composed in public, but her hands were not quite steady. "He was here again, Nana," she said, "just that." I turned to look back at the pew. The man was still sitting there. He had not moved. He had not looked toward us. He was perhaps 80 years old, or close to it, with a face that had the particular quality of someone who had spent a great deal of time outdoors in the kind of weather that Wales produces with such consistency, weathered and deeply lined, but with a stillness behind the eyes that suggested a person who thought a great deal and spoke very little. "Does he come often?" I asked. Katrin considered her answer for a moment longer than the question seemed to require. "Whenever Alun is away." My son Alun, 59 years old, a structural engineer who spends his working life restoring historic bridges, which has always seemed fitting to me, that a man raised inside the sound of an organ should dedicate himself to the preservation of things that hold other things together. He had left for a project in Pembrokeshire the previous week and was not expected home until the following Monday. I looked at Katrin again. She was watching the old man with an expression I could not quite categorize, not fear and not anger and not grief, but something that contained traces of all three. "Who is he?" I asked. She shook her head very slightly. "I don't know his name. None of us do. He never speaks to anyone. He arrives before rehearsal begins, and he leaves before it ends. Except tonight he stayed longer than usual, and when we got to the last hymn, I simply—" She paused. I couldn't sing it, with him watching. I don't know why. It felt wrong in a way I cannot explain. I squeezed her hand. I told her to get her coat, and I would wait. I stood in the side aisle, and I watched the old man for a moment longer. He had opened the leather portfolio across his knees now, and he was looking at something inside it, pages or drawings or documents of some kind. I could not see from that distance. His expression as he looked at whatever he was holding was not the expression of a man doing ordinary work. It was the expression of someone reading a letter from a person they have not spoken to in many years. A mixture of sorrow and attention so complete that the cathedral itself seemed to lean in toward him. Then he closed the portfolio. He stood with the careful deliberateness of a man whose joints remember the cold. He put on his coat. He walked to the west door without looking at anyone, and he was gone. I drove Katrin home to the house she shares with her mother on the quiet road east of the cathedral close. We talked about other things on the drive, the way families do when something unspoken is hanging in the air between them and neither person quite knows how to begin. Katrin told me about a new tenor who had joined the choir. I told her about the frost I had found on my garden that morning. We said goodnight on her doorstep with a warmth that had nothing performative about it. Katrin and I have never needed performance with each other. I drove on to see Bethan. My daughter-in-law lives in a tall stone terrace on a street that looks out over the cathedral and the Elwy Valley below. A house she has occupied for 26 years with the particular commitment of someone who chose a place not for convenience, but for what it means. Bethan Hughes is 57 years old, and she spends her professional life restoring antique liturgical textiles for historic churches across Wales, a work of extraordinary patience and precision, removing centuries of damage from embroidered vestments and altar cloths stitch by stitch, returning color and form to things that had seemed permanently lost. She is, in many respects, the most methodical person I have ever known. She does not alarm easily. She does not speak carelessly. She measures her words the way she measures thread, with an awareness that the wrong choice can unravel everything. I found her in the kitchen with a cup of tea going cold on the table beside a spread of photographs documenting a 17th century baptismal cloth she was working on. She looked up when I came in. She read my face before I said a word, the way she always reads faces, with the full attention she gives to everything she considers worth understanding. I told her about the man in the pew. I described him as accurately as I could. The age, the coat, the portfolio, the particular quality of his stillness, the way the choir director had stopped the rehearsal. The fact that he came whenever Alan was away. Bethan set down her magnifying glass very carefully. She looked at me for a long moment, and then, with something leaving her expression that I had not even realized was there until it was gone, she said, very quietly, "Then it has started again." She said nothing more. She turned back to the photographs on the table as if she could prevent the past from entering the kitchen by refusing to look at the door through which it had just walked. I sat across from her for nearly an hour that evening. I made a fresh pot of tea. I waited. Bethan did not speak about the man again. She spoke about the baptismal cloth. She spoke about an invoice she needed to send before the end of the week. She spoke about Catherine's voice, which she said had sounded tired lately, in the way voices do when their owner is carrying something heavy. And then she said goodnight with the careful politeness of someone who has decided to postpone a conversation they know they cannot avoid forever. I drove home in the dark through streets I have known for most of my life. The cathedral was lit from below, as it always is in the evening, the pale stone glowing against the black sky, the tower rising above the valley in a way that has always seemed to me both ancient and completely certain of itself. I parked in front of my house, which is a low stone cottage on a lane that has not changed materially since I was a girl, and I sat in the car for a moment longer than I needed to. Then it has started again. I turned those words over in my mind the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling for the weight of it, the particular shape of it, the way the edges catch the light. They were not the words of someone describing something new. They were the words of someone recognizing a return, a resumption, something that had been suspended at some point in the past and had now, without warning, begun again. I went inside and I made myself a small supper I did not eat. I went to bed and I did not sleep until nearly 4 a.m. And when I finally did sleep, I dreamed of the sound of an organ playing a hymn that no one in the dream could identify. A melody that felt completely familiar and utterly unknown at the same time. The way certain things feel when you realize you have been hearing them all your life without ever truly listening. I want to tell you who I am before I go any further into this story, because what I found in the weeks that followed only makes sense if you understand the life I had lived before that October evening. I grew up in this part of North Wales, the third of 4 children born to parents who both worked for the church in one capacity or another, my father as a craftsman who built and maintained pipe organs for churches across the diocese, and my mother as a seamstress who repaired choir vestments with the same quiet devotion that Bethan would later bring to her own restoration work. There are patterns in families, I have learned. The same essential loves find different forms in different generations, but the underlying devotion remains recognizable across time, like a musical theme that passes from one instrument to another without losing its fundamental character. I learned the inside of a pipe organ before I learned to drive a car. I could identify the tonal character of an open diapason from a stopped one at the age of 12 by placing my hand against the resonating wooden case and feeling the difference in the vibration. My father believed that to build or restore something sacred, you needed to understand not just its construction, but its purpose. The relationship between the instrument and the music it was built to carry, between the music and the prayer it was built to support, between the prayer and the people whose lives it moved through. That is a kind of education you cannot receive in a classroom. It is the education of long attention, paid to something that rewards attention with more than it withholds. I worked alongside my father from the age of 15 until his death when I was 31. After he died, I continued the work on my own for several years before eventually finding a partner, a craftsman from Carmarthenshire named David Hughes, who became first my professional collaborator and then my husband, and whose death at the age of 62 from a quiet and entirely unexpected illness is the fact of my life I have never fully learned to carry without feeling its weight in my chest on the worst mornings. Alun is our son. He is the thing David and I made that I am most completely proud of, not because he became what we hoped, or because he followed some path we mapped out for him, but because he became, with remarkable integrity, entirely himself. He chose structures rather than instruments, bridges rather than bellows, the engineering of enduring physical things rather than the engineering of enduring sound. But he has the same underlying devotion. Anyone who knows him can see it. He does not restore bridges because it is a good profession. He restores them because he genuinely believes that the things human beings built with care and skill deserve to outlast the particular moment in which they were built. That is the same belief my father held, the same belief I hold. It simply found its way into a different form. I met Bethan at a diocesan gathering nearly 30 years ago, the year before she and Alan married. She was there in a professional capacity, presenting some restoration work she had done on an 18th century cope belonging to a parish in Flintshire. I was there because the cathedral chapter had asked me to assess the condition of the nave organ, which had developed a cipher in its treble register that was producing a continuous, slightly maddening sound during services. We sat next to each other during a break in the proceedings and discovered within approximately 4 minutes of conversation that we were both people who spent their professional lives trying to recover something that had been damaged or lost, and that we both understood this as work that was worth doing for reasons that could not be entirely reduced to money or reputation or ambition. I liked her immediately and completely. I have liked her that way ever since. So when Bethan said those 4 words in her kitchen on that October evening and then fell silent, the silence itself told me something. Bethan does not withhold information carelessly. She does not choose silence out of drama or evasiveness or any desire to make things more mysterious than they are. She chooses silence when she is protecting something, when she has made a promise that silence is the price of honoring. And the particular quality of the silence she gave me that night, the way it arranged itself around the words she had just spoken, was the silence of someone who had hoped very sincerely that a specific thing would not happen and had now been told by events that their hope was misplaced. I lay awake in my cottage and I thought about Edmund Carlyle, though I did not yet know his name was Edmund Carlyle. I thought about the way he had held his portfolio across his knees with the careful attention of someone holding something irreplaceable. I thought about the way he had looked at whatever was inside it, with that expression compounded of sorrow and attention. I thought about the fact that he came when Alan was not there, and I thought about the fact that my granddaughter, who is one of the calmest and most musically assured people I have ever known, had been unable to complete a rehearsal because of his presence. Some things announce themselves loudly. They arrive with disruption and noise and the unambiguous signal that the world has changed. But other things arrive quietly, taking a seat in the back of a cathedral and waiting with great patience for someone to finally pay attention. I have learned over 79 years of living that the second kind are often more significant than the first. The thing that waits is always more serious than the thing that announces itself immediately, because the thing that waits has somewhere to be. It knows the address. It has come from a long way away, and it will not leave until it has delivered what it came to deliver. The following morning, I got up early. I made my tea. I stood at my kitchen window, looking out at the lane, at the autumn leaves that had gathered in the corner by the stone wall where they always gather at this time of year. And I made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like an acknowledgement that some questions, once they establish themselves in your mind, do not permit you the luxury of not pursuing them. I was going to find out who the old man was, and I was going to understand, eventually, what it was that had started again. I did not go to Bethan first. That may surprise you, given that she had clearly recognized the man from my description, had responded to his presence with something she could not entirely conceal, even in her own kitchen. But I have known Bethan long enough to understand that pressing her directly for information she has chosen not to offer is not an effective strategy and is, more importantly, not respectful of whatever arrangement she has made with herself about this particular subject. Bethan is a woman of extraordinary moral seriousness. If she has made a promise, she intends to keep it. The right approach was not to challenge that promise, but to understand it well enough that eventually she would see there was no longer anything to protect by maintaining it. I went to the cathedral archive first, St. Asaph Cathedral maintains one of the smaller but more meticulously organized diocesan archives in North Wales, a room on the upper floor of a building adjacent to the chapter house, with tall, narrow windows that let in the kind of thin northern light that seems to belong specifically to this part of the world, cool and precise and without sentimentality. The archivist there, a woman named Mrs. Price, who has occupied that role for nearly as long as I have been retired, knows my face and my particular interest in the history of the cathedral's musical instruments. She let me in without difficulty on a gray Thursday morning and gave me the kind of knowing look that archivists give when someone arrives with the expression of a person conducting a search they are not yet prepared to fully describe. I began with the choir registers. These are the ledgers in which the names of choir members and directors are recorded across the years, along with attendance and occasionally notes about significant events in the choir's life. I was not looking for anything specific yet. I was creating a map. The choir, as Katrin directs it now, has existed in roughly its current form since the mid-1990s, when a reorganization of the cathedral's musical program brought it under the supervision of a professional director rather than rotating the role among senior members. Before that, the records showed a more informal arrangement, with direction shared between the cathedral organist and various volunteers with appropriate musical training. The name I was searching for, though I did not yet know exactly what I was searching for, began to appear in a different set of records entirely. It was not the choir registers that gave me the first real thread to pull. It was the restoration invoices. There is a substantial file of documentation relating to the cathedral's major restoration project of the 1980s and early 90s. A decade-long program of structural and aesthetic repair that addressed damage accumulated over many generations and brought in craftspeople and surveyors from across Wales and beyond. My own father had been involved in the early stages of that project, specifically in an assessment of the organ loft and the structural elements supporting the instrument. I knew about the project in a general way because it had been part of the landscape of my professional life during those years. What I had not known, sitting in that archive room with the thin October light coming through the narrow windows, was the specific names of every firm and individual involved in the later phases of the work. Carlisle Architectural Survey. The name appeared first on an invoice dated the 14th of September, 1989, then again in March of the following year. Then, several more times across a period of approximately 4 years, running through to the spring of 1993. The invoices were for structural assessment work, specifically the evaluation of stonework in the north transept and the chapter house roof, areas that required expert judgment about the load-bearing integrity of medieval construction. The signature on each invoice was the same, a careful, slightly formal, cursive hand that wrote Edmund R. Carlisle, and then a set of professional qualifications below. I sat very still with that piece of paper in my hands. Edmund Carlisle. So that was his name. And he had worked inside this cathedral for at least 4 years, more than 30 years ago, doing precisely the kind of careful structural assessment that my son Alun had built his own career upon. I want to stop here for just a moment, if you will allow an old woman that indulgence, because I have just described finding a name in a document, and I am aware that to tell it plainly like that does not quite convey what it actually felt like to sit in that archive room and put the name to the face. There is a particular quality to the moment when something that has been abstract, a presence, a whisper, a sentence left unfinished in a kitchen, becomes concrete, a name, a signature, a set of professional qualifications written in careful cursive on a diocesan invoice. The world reorganizes itself slightly, like a lens finding its focus. Before I tell you what else I found that day, I want to ask you something, because I think someone listening to this story right now knows exactly what I mean when I describe that feeling. Have you ever found a name in an old document and felt the weight of a whole story pressing against the paper from the other side? Tell me in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from. What city or town are you sitting in right now? And if this story is making you feel something, please leave a like. It takes only a second, and it means the world to me. Subscribe if you have not already, because there is a fresh story here every single day. Now let me tell you what the invoices led me to next. The invoices themselves were routine, professional. They told me what work had been commissioned and what had been charged for it, and they confirmed that Edmund Carlisle had been a presence in this cathedral over a significant period during the restoration project. But it was not the invoices themselves that mattered most. It was what I found folded inside the back cover of the file that contained them. Someone, at some point, had tucked a letter inside that file. Not an official correspondence, not a diocesan communication. A personal letter, handwritten on plain paper in a hand quite different from the careful cursive of the professional invoices, larger and more rapid, the hand of someone writing with some urgency or emotion. It was addressed simply to D, with no surname, and it was signed in a way I found immediately arresting. It was signed with a single initial, also D, and below that, in smaller letters, with all respect for what you decided. I will keep my word. The letter was undated. The body of it was brief. It spoke in careful, indirect language about a decision that had been reached, a decision that would protect something described only as the work and the people the work depended on. It spoke about a contribution that had made the completion of a phase of the project possible when the funding had become uncertain. And it acknowledged, with a plainness that I found both admirable and somehow heartbreaking, that the person who had made that contribution would never be publicly credited for it, because public credit would require explanations that at the time nobody involved was prepared to give. I sat with that letter for a long time. Mrs. Price appeared once to ask if I needed anything, and I told her I was quite comfortable, thank you. And she nodded and withdrew. Outside the narrow windows, the October morning was turning into afternoon, and the light was shifting from thin gray to something slightly warmer, a brief concession autumn makes in North Wales before the real cold arrives. I thought about my father. I thought about the organ assessment he had done in the early phase of the restoration. I thought about Alan and the way he had learned his profession, not formally at first, but through summers spent on various heritage sites, initially helping with general work, eventually demonstrating a natural talent for structural assessment that his later engineering qualifications formalized and gave language to. Alan had done some work connected to the cathedral restoration during his early 20s. I remembered this vaguely. It had seemed unremarkable at the time. Young man learning his trade, assisting qualified surveyors, the ordinary apprenticeship of someone finding their way into a technical profession. But I was beginning to understand that the ordinary surface of those years contained something I had not been invited to see. I took careful notes. I documented the invoice dates, the name, the professional qualifications, the reference numbers. I asked Mrs. Price, with what I hoped was casual conversational interest, whether the archive held any other materials relating to the restoration project's later phases, specifically from the period 1990 to 1993. She told me there was a second file in the lower drawer containing correspondence with the various contractors and consultants, and that there were also some materials in the diocesan collection proper, held at the record office in Ruthin, which would require a separate appointment to access. I wrote down the address of the record office and drove home through the early November dark, which arrives in North Wales with a thoroughness that always reminds me of something being carefully covered over, not destroyed, simply made less visible for a time. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my notes spread in front of me, and I thought about Bethan. I thought about the restoration work she had done across the decades for churches all over Wales, including work she had done for this cathedral. I thought about the needle and thread approach she brings to everything, the belief that patience and precision can recover what carelessness or time has damaged, stitch by careful stitch. And I thought about the particular quality of her silence on the evening I had described Edmund Carlisle to her, with tears quietly filling her eyes. She had recognized him, not from a meeting, from something older than a meeting, from a history she had promised to protect. I am going to tell you something about growing old that people sometimes forget, or perhaps never entirely understand until they arrive at the threshold of it themselves. The accumulation of years does not simply mean the accumulation of limitations. It also means the accumulation of pattern recognition. You have seen enough by the time you are 79 to notice things that are invisible to someone who has only seen 40 or 50 years of the world. You recognize the shape of a situation because you have seen that shape before, not necessarily in the same circumstances or with the same people, but in its essential outline, its fundamental emotional architecture. And that recognition is not nosiness. It is not interference. It is wisdom trying to make itself useful before it is too late to do so. I recognized something in the silence Bethan had given me. I recognized the shape of a person trying to honor a promise whose time had perhaps run out. I also recognized something in the way Edmund Carlyle had sat in that cathedral pew with his leather portfolio across his knees and his eyes on something the rest of the congregation could not see. I recognized the shape of a person who had come to complete something that had been left incompletely finished for a very long time. The following week, I drove to Ruthin. The record office there occupies a building on a quiet street in the town center, a pleasant, professionally maintained space where the county's archival materials are preserved and made accessible to researchers who know to ask for them. I had telephoned ahead, and the staff had pulled the relevant files from the diocesan collection, so they were ready for me when I arrived. What I found there took me several hours to fully read and understand. There were letters. Not just the single-folded one I had found in the archive at the cathedral, but a sequence of letters spanning several years, written between Edmund Carlyle and a member of the cathedral chapter who had since retired to Aberystwyth and, I later learned, died there some years ago. The letters documented, in careful and occasionally coded language, the circumstances surrounding a critical moment in the restoration project's middle phase. In the spring of 1991, the project had encountered a funding crisis. A grant from a heritage body had been delayed due to a dispute about the documentation of certain work that had already been completed. Without that grant arriving on schedule, the contract with the structural survey firm could not be continued, which meant that a phase of the work on the chapter house roof would have to be suspended, potentially for years. The craftspeople and tradespeople who had been engaged for that phase faced the loss of their contracts. Edmund Carlyle had been the principal surveyor for that phase of the work, and according to the letters, he had made a private arrangement that allowed the work to continue. The details of that arrangement were described with a careful vagueness in the earlier letters, and with somewhat more clarity in the later ones. Edmund had deferred a substantial portion of his own fees, effectively lending that money to the project without interest and without any formal documentation of the loan, because formal documentation would have required disclosure to the grant body and would have complicated the resolution of the original dispute. He had done this on the understanding, documented only in these private letters, that when the grant situation was resolved and the project's finances were stable, the deferred fees would be repaid with acknowledgement in the formal project record. The grant situation was eventually resolved. The project's finances stabilized. The work on the chapter house roof was completed successfully and stands to this day as a model of sensitive historic restoration. The deferred fees were repaid, but the acknowledgement in the formal project record was never made, because by the time the financial situation resolved, a complication had emerged. The complication was my son, Alan. During the period of the funding crisis, when Edmund Carlyle was managing the situation with the particular discreet competence the letters revealed as characteristic of him, Alan had been working on the site in the unofficial assisting capacity I have described. He was 26 years old. He was not yet a qualified engineer. He was simply a young man with a demonstrable talent for the work and a passionate interest in the application of structural principles to historic buildings. Edmund Carlyle had recognized that talent, which was the kind of thing Edmund Carlyle apparently did, paid close attention to the people around him, and recognized capacities they had not yet fully demonstrated to themselves. Edmund had written a letter of professional recommendation for Alan. Not a general letter, but a highly specific one, addressed to a senior partner at a prominent engineering firm that was beginning, at that time, to build a practice around heritage structures. The letter described in detailed, technically precise language the quality of Alan's instincts, his patience, his understanding of how historic materials behave under stress, and his unusual ability to communicate structural findings in ways that non-specialists could understand. A quality that in heritage work is as important as the technical knowledge itself. That letter had been instrumental in Alan obtaining his first serious professional position, the position that launched the career he has spent his life building. The complication, the reason the acknowledgement had never been made, was this. At the time, the formal project record was being compiled. The chapter member handling the documentation had realized that formally acknowledging Edmund's financial contribution would require explaining the circumstances of the funding crisis in more detail than was comfortable for the heritage body involved, whose delay in releasing the grant had created the crisis in the first place. There were professional relationships at stake. There were future grant applications to consider. And Edmund Carlyle, when the situation was explained to him, had agreed, as was apparently characteristic of him, to accept the financial repayment without the formal acknowledgement, provided that certain conditions were met. One of those conditions, the one that pressed against my chest as I sat reading those letters in the quiet of the Ruthin Record Office, was that Alan's career and the foundation of it would remain undisturbed. Edmund had been precise about this in the letters. He was not asking for credit in exchange for silence about the financial arrangement. He was asking, and asking very plainly, that the young man he had recommended should have the opportunity his talent deserved without the complicated history of the project's middle phase attaching itself to his professional reputation before he had even fully established that reputation. He was protecting Alan. Before Alan had any idea there was anything to protect him from. I sat back in my chair in the record office and I looked at the pale gray ceiling for a long moment. Outside, a car passed on the quiet street. The heating system in the building made a gentle sound. And I thought about a question I had never thought to ask in 30 years of knowing my son and being proud of his achievements. I had always understood Alan's career as the result of his own considerable talent, his own devotion to the work, his own integrity. And all of that was true. All of it remained true. Nothing I was reading in these letters diminished any of it. But I was understanding, for the first time, that there had been a hand extended to him at the exact moment he needed it most, from a man he had probably known as the quietly competent senior surveyor who seemed to take a particular interest in the work of a young assistant, and that this hand had been extended with a specific selflessness that the young man who received it had never known to be grateful for. And then the question that had been forming in the back of my mind since the evening in Bethan's kitchen finally arrived at its full, clear shape. Did Bethan know? Had she known all along? And if she had, what had she promised, and to whom, and for how long? I want to stop here for a moment, because what I have just described is one of those discoveries that changes the texture of everything you thought you understood about your own life. And I want to ask you something. Have you ever learned something about your own family that made you see years of ordinary history in an entirely different light? Not something scandalous, not something dramatic, but simply something true that had been kept quiet, for reasons that turned out to be reasons of love rather than reasons of shame. Tell me in the comments. I am genuinely asking. And please subscribe if you have not already, because there is a new story here every single day. This one is not finished yet. Not by a long way. I drove home from Ruthin through the late afternoon, through the kind of North Wales landscape that has always seemed to me to contain more history per square mile than most places on earth. The hills dark against a sky that was turning the color of old pewter, the hedgerows leafless now and showing the bones of the land beneath. I thought about Edmund Carlyle driving to this cathedral for the first time more than 30 years ago with his leather portfolio and his professional qualifications and his gift for paying attention to the structural truth of things. I thought about him sitting in the last pew now with that same portfolio across his knees, arriving when Alan was away, watching without speaking, waiting for something. I thought about Bethan's tears. Then it has started again. Not a crisis, not a scandal. A return. Something that had been resolved, or more accurately something that had been managed, was presenting itself once more in the person of an 81-year-old man sitting quietly in the back of a cathedral with documents that contained a history no one had ever fully spoken aloud. I thought about the letter I had found in the archive, signed with a single initial and a promise. I will keep my word. And I thought that whatever word Edmund Carlyle had kept for 3 decades, he had not come back to St. Asaph Cathedral to break it. He had come back for a different reason entirely. The reason that people return to places where important things happen to them, when they are old enough to understand that the time for keeping certain silences is drawing to a close, and that the only real dishonor would be to let those silences outlast the people who had chosen them. He had come back, I believed, to finally say something, and somewhere in the question of what he had come to say, and to whom, and why now, the rest of this story was waiting for me to find it. I want to tell you what it feels like to know something that everyone around you has decided they do not wish to know. It is not like ordinary loneliness. Ordinary loneliness is the absence of company. This was something different. This was the presence of a truth that had weight and temperature and took up physical space in every room I entered, and yet which the people I loved most had collectively, silently, agreed to pretend was not standing there. I had driven home from Ruthin with the notes I had made spread across the passenger seat beside me. I had made a pot of tea I did not drink. I had sat at my kitchen table as the evening came in through the window, and I had looked at what I had written, and I had thought about the specific quality of Bethan's silence, the way she had turned back to her photographs of the baptismal cloth as though the conversation had not happened, as though I had not just described to her a man whose name and history I now held in my hands. I thought about what she had said. Then it has started again. Not then, something has started. Then it has started again. The word again carrying inside it an entire history she had not shared with me. I want to pause here for just a moment, because what I am about to tell you next is the part of this story that still makes my hands unsteady when I think about it. Before I get there, I want to say something to whoever is listening right now. Wherever you are watching from, whatever time it is where you are, whether you are in Cardiff or in London or somewhere I have never been and will never visit, I want you to know that I read every single comment you leave here, and they matter to me more than I can properly express. If this story is reaching something in you, please leave a like. It takes a moment, and it tells me that these old memories are worth the effort of putting into words. Subscribe if you have not already, because there is a new story here every single day. And now let me tell you about the morning I went back to the cathedral archive and found the thing I had not gone looking for. I had returned to see Mrs. Price because I had a specific question. The invoices I had found documented Edmund Carlyle's professional involvement in the restoration project through the spring of 1993. But they did not tell me what had ended the engagement. Restoration projects of that scope typically maintained their surveying relationships until the final phase of work was complete and signed off. The chapter house roof project, which Edmund had been assessing, was documented as complete in the diocesan records as of the summer of 1993. So why was there a gap in the invoices between the spring of that year and the official project completion? 4 months during which, as far as the formal records showed, no work had been billed by Carlyle Architectural Survey. Mrs. Price found the answer in a folder I had not thought to request, a file of correspondence between the cathedral chapter and the various contractors relating to the formal sign-off process at the project's end. There was a letter from the chapter to Edmund Carlyle, dated the 14th of June, 1993, thanking him for his service to the project and informing him that the structural assessment phase had been formally concluded. The letter was correct in tone, warm even, acknowledging the quality of the work and the professionalism with which it had been conducted. But the date on that letter was 3 months before the chapter house roof work was officially signed off as complete. Edmund Carlisle had been released from the project before the work he had been assessing was finished. Someone had made a decision to end his engagement early, and the letter did not explain why. I sat with that fact for a long time. I thought about the sequence of it. The funding crisis in the spring of 1991. Edmund's private arrangement that had allowed the work to continue. The letter of recommendation for Alan. The deferred fees repaid without formal acknowledgement. And then, 2 years later, a quiet and courteous termination of professional engagement before the work was done. The pattern had a logic to it. Someone had decided that once Edmund's financial contribution had been repaid and the project was near enough to its conclusion to manage without him, his continued presence was an inconvenience, not because of anything he had done wrong, but because of what he knew. He knew about the funding crisis. He knew about the private arrangement. He knew that a decision had been made to protect the project's public record at the expense of his own recognition. He had agreed to those terms. He had kept his word. And then, apparently, he had been asked to leave. I drove from the archive directly to Bethan's house. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I did not telephone ahead. I simply arrived. I knocked on her door. She opened it and looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone who had been expecting this visit and had been hoping it would not come. Then she stepped back and let me in. We sat at her kitchen table. The magnifying glass was there again, and the photographs of the baptismal cloth, and the tea that was already made, as if she had known she would need it. I put my notes on the table between us, and I said, without preamble, because Bethan has never needed preamble from me. I know about the funding crisis. I know about the deferred fees. I know about the letter of recommendation for Alan, and I know that Edmund Carlisle was asked to leave the project before his work was done. What I do not know is what it has to do with Katrin, and I need you to help me understand. Bethan looked at my notes for a long moment without touching them. Then she looked at me, and something left her face that I recognized as a decision finally made after a very long time of refusing to make it. She said, I met Edmund Carlisle in 1992. I had been commissioned to assess the condition of some embroidered panels in the chapter house. That was how I came to be inside the restoration project, not as a full contractor, but as a specialist brought in for a specific assessment. Edmund was there regularly at that point, managing the structural survey of the roof. We spoke on several occasions, professionally at first, and then with the particular ease that comes between people who share a certain disposition toward their work, toward the idea that things worth preserving are worth the patience required to preserve them properly. She paused. I waited. I knew about the funding arrangement, she said. Not at the time, but later. Edmund told me himself at the end of that year. He told me because by then we had developed the kind of working friendship in which a person sometimes needs to share the weight of something they have been carrying alone. He was not asking for anything. He was simply telling someone the truth of what had happened because the truth had been pressing against him and he needed somewhere to put it. And what was the arrangement? I asked, though I already knew most of it. I wanted to hear it from Bethan because Bethan's version would contain what the letters in Ruthin could not contain, which was the living texture of it. She told me. The deferred fees, the decision to protect the project's public record, the condition about Alun, the letter of recommendation that had launched my son's career. All of it, from the inside, from the account of someone who had heard it from Edmund himself during a conversation in a cold chapter house in the winter of 1992. And then she said the thing I had not yet found in any archive. The letter of recommendation was not all Edmund did for Alan, she said. When the firm Edmund recommended him to offer Alan the position, there was a question about his formal qualifications. He had the talent and the practical experience, but he was not yet a chartered engineer. The firm needed someone to vouch for his technical competence at a level that would satisfy their professional requirements. Edmund wrote a second letter, a more formal one, addressing specific technical assessments Alan had done on the project, describing in precise professional language why a man who was not yet fully chartered should be trusted with the kind of work this firm did. That letter existed outside the official project record. It was a personal professional act of considerable risk on Edmund's part, because if Alan had underperformed in that position, Edmund's own professional reputation would have been affected. I sat with that for a moment. 2 letters then, not one, and Alan knew about neither of them. Did Alan ever know any of this? I asked. Bethan shook her head. Never. By the time I came to know Alan well, Edmund had already been asked to leave the project. The situation had resolved itself, or appeared to have resolved itself, in the way that complicated situations sometimes appear to resolve when everyone involved agrees to stop mentioning them. I had promised Edmund that I would not speak of it unless he chose to raise it himself. He was not bitter. He was not seeking restitution. He had made his choices with open eyes, and he was at peace with them. He simply wanted to know that someone remembered what had actually happened. I was that someone. She wrapped both hands around her teacup. Her voice was very steady. When you told me he was in the cathedral, she said, I knew exactly what it meant. Edmund is 81 years old. He is not in perfect health. I have kept his confidence for 30 years, but he has come back. And a man of 81 who has come back to the place where something important happened, who comes when the person most connected to his history is absent, who sits in the back pew with his documents and his portfolio and does not speak to anyone, that man has come back because he has decided that the time for silence is nearly over. I reached across the table and I took her hand. She let me. What did he want? I asked, when he first started coming. Did you ever speak to him? She was quiet for a moment. Then, once, 6 weeks ago, in the cathedral car park after an evening service. He recognized me. We had not seen each other since before I married Alan more than 25 years ago. He was very calm, very composed. He said he had not come to cause trouble. He said he had come because there were documents he had carried for 30 years that did not belong to him, that belonged to the cathedral's proper historical record, and that he could not die, his word, with those documents locked in a portfolio in his study, when they should be where history could find them. She squeezed my hand once and released it. He asked me if I thought Alun would want to know. Not about the financial arrangement. That was documented in his papers regardless. But about the letters, about what Edmund had done for a young man who had never been told it was done. I had no answer for her in that moment. Instead, I asked her the question that had been forming at the back of my mind since the archive at Ruthin. What do you think Alan would want to know? She looked out the window at the valley. The lights of the cathedral were visible in the early dark. I think, she said carefully, that a man who has spent his entire professional life trying to ensure that the things other people built are properly understood and preserved probably deserves to understand what was built for him. And who built it? I drove home in the dark, and I sat in my cottage with the notes spread on the kitchen table and a cup of tea going cold beside them. And I thought about my son. I thought about the young man he had been at 26, talented and eager and entirely unaware of the particular kindness that had been extended to him by a man he probably remembered vaguely as the competent senior surveyor who sometimes asked useful questions. I thought about the career that had grown from that foundation, 30 years of work done with genuine integrity and skill, bridges restored, historic structures preserved, a professional reputation earned through sustained and serious effort. None of that was diminished by what I now knew. If anything, it was deepened because it told me something true about the kind of person Edmund Carlyle was, that he had looked at a young man with talent and had chosen to help him without condition and without expectation of gratitude. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a great deal. And then I thought about Katrin, who directed the choir with such calm authority. Katrin, who had stopped the rehearsal on that October evening because she could not sing the final hymn with Edmund Carlyle watching from the back pew. I had been so focused on the history surrounding Edmund, the invoices and the letters and the 30-year-old arrangement, that I had not yet asked myself the specific question of what this had to do with her. Why did his presence affect her so strongly if she did not know who he was? I telephoned her the following morning. She was at the cathedral, preparing for a morning rehearsal, and she spoke quietly in the way she does when she is somewhere public and does not want to be overheard. I asked her to tell me, as precisely as she could, what she felt when she saw Edmund Carlyle in the back pew. Not what she thought, what she felt. There was a long pause. Then she said, "I feel watched." Not in a frightening way. In a way that feels, and I know this sounds strange, Nana, like being observed by someone who knows something about you that you don't know yourself. I held the phone very still. "Has he ever approached you?" I asked. "No," she said. "Never. He just watches." But there are times, during rehearsal, when I look up and find him looking at me with this expression that I can only describe as, and she paused again, as recognition. As though he is looking at something familiar, something that means a great deal to him. I thanked her. I told her I was beginning to understand and that I would explain everything when I had the full picture. She trusted me enough to accept that without pressing further, which is one of the particular gifts Katrin has always given me. I sat with what she had said. Recognition. Edmund Carlyle was sitting in that cathedral watching Katrin Hughes direct her choir and experiencing recognition. Not of Katrin herself, whom he had never met, but of something he saw in her, something he knew. I thought about what Edmund had told Bethan 30 years ago, that he had not come to cause trouble, that he had documents that belonged to the cathedral's historical record, that he had asked whether Alan would want to know about the letters. And I thought about the specific thing Edmund would see if he sat in the back of that cathedral and watched a 34-year-old woman lead an adult choir with quiet authority and musical intelligence and evident deep love for the sacred space she worked in. He would see the daughter of the man he had helped. He would see what that help had become, not just Alan's career, but Alan's family, Alan's life, the generations that had grown from the foundation that Edmund had helped lay. He would see in Katrin the living continuation of a story that had mattered to him enough to carry in a leather portfolio for 30 years. I needed to speak with Edmund Carlyle directly. Finding him was easier than I had expected. Mrs. Price, who had by now developed a benign professional interest in my investigation, had noted that the restoration invoices from Carlyle Architectural Survey had listed an address in Prestatyn, a coastal town approximately 12 miles north of St. Asaph along the Clwydian Range. She had noted it in the way that archivists note things, not drawing attention to it, but making it available in case it was useful. It was a business address from 30 years ago and might mean nothing. But in small Welsh towns, addresses sometimes mean more than they ought to. I drove to Prestatyn on a grey November morning, along the coast road with the Irish Sea somewhere out beyond the low mist, and I found that the address corresponded to a terrace of stone houses on a quiet residential street near the town centre where a man named E. Carlyle was listed on the small brass plate beside the door of the second house. I knocked. He opened the door himself, which surprised me somehow, though I cannot say what I had expected. He was taller than I had thought, seeing him only at a distance across a cathedral nave. The face I had observed through the shadow of a stone pillar was, at close range, the face of a man who had spent a long life thinking seriously about the world and had arrived at a kind of peace with most of what he had found there. He had the leather portfolio under one arm, which seemed so characteristic of him that I almost smiled. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Hughes, I had wondered when you would come." "Please," I said, "call me Gwendolen." He stepped back from the door, and I went inside. He made tea with the methodical competence of someone who has lived alone long enough to have reduced all domestic processes to their most efficient form. The house was quiet and ordered, with the particular quality of a space occupied by a person who does not accumulate things carelessly. There were books on the shelves. There were drawings on the walls, architectural drawings of historic structures, some of which I recognized as churches I had worked in during my own career. There was a photograph on the mantelpiece of two people I did not know, a man and a woman of middle age, smiling in front of a building that I thought I recognized as the chapter house at St. Asaph Cathedral. We sat at his kitchen table with our tea, and I told him what I had found: the invoices, the letters in Ruthin, the letter of recommendation, the second letter about qualifications, the termination of engagement in June of 1993. I laid it out carefully and completely, the way my father taught me to approach any technical problem, with precision and without sentiment, so that the person on the other side of the table can understand exactly what you know and can respond to the truth of it rather than to an impression of it. He listened without interrupting. When I had finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You are a thorough woman, Gwendolyn." I told him I had been trained to be. He set down his teacup. He said, "I want to be clear about something. I have not come back to St. Asaph to collect a debt. What was owed to me financially was repaid 30 years ago. What was owed to me in terms of recognition, I made my own peace with a long time ago. Recognition was not the point of what I did. The point was that the work continued, and the building was preserved, and a young man with genuine talent had a chance to use it. All of those things happened. That is enough." "Then why?" I said. He looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece for a moment, then back at me. "The woman in that photograph," he said, "is my daughter. She died 4 years ago. She was 52. She had been a musician. She played the organ for a parish in Flintshire for nearly 20 years. He paused. She had a particular gift for sacred music, for understanding the relationship between an instrument and the space it was built to inhabit. She loved that cathedral. She was there as a child for services during the Restoration. She used to say that a building that old had absorbed so much music into its stones that you could feel it vibrating if you pressed your hand against the wall." He looked at his hands. "When she died, I spent some time thinking about the things I had left unfinished. Documents I had held that belonged elsewhere. Correspondence that had been sealed in my study for 30 years that ought to be part of the proper historical record of a building that has stood in this valley for 9 centuries. Not for my sake, for the building's sake. For the sake of whatever understanding history develops about that particular restoration, about who was there and what they contributed and what it cost them." He stood and lifted the leather portfolio from the chair where he had set it. He placed it on the table between us and opened it. The drawings were there, just as I had observed from a distance in the cathedral, original restoration drawings with handwritten annotations in Edmund's precise professional hand. But underneath them were the letters. The originals, not copies. The correspondence that documented the funding crisis and the private arrangement, and the 2 letters written for Alan. "I want these to be part of the diocesan archive," he said, "properly catalogued, properly preserved. The cathedral chapter should know the full history of that restoration, including the parts that were managed quietly at the time for reasons that seemed good then and may seem less good now. And Alan should know what was done for him and why, not to create an obligation, because there is none, but because a man who has devoted his life to the preservation of honest historical record probably deserves to know the honest historical record of his own beginning." I sat for a long moment looking at those documents. Then I asked him, "Why do you come when Alan is away?" He looked at the table. Then, "Because I am not yet entirely certain how to approach it. I have been watching the cathedral, watching Katrin direct that choir, and I have been reminding myself of what is actually there, the continuation of something that mattered, trying to find the correct way in." He looked up. "And I am 81 years old, and I am somewhat out of practice at beginning difficult conversations." I almost laughed. I told him I was 79 and felt exactly the same way about most things. We spent another hour at his kitchen table, and by the end of it we had made an arrangement. I would speak to Bethan, which meant Bethan would tell Alan enough to prepare him, and then Edmund and Alan would meet. Not in the cathedral, not initially, but somewhere ordinary and warm, where a conversation of this kind could find its own level. Edmund would bring the documents, and Alan would hear the full story of what had been done for him and who had done it and why. And the documents would then be donated to the Diocesan Archive at St. Asaph Cathedral, with Edmund's full name and contribution properly recorded in the historical record of the restoration. It was not a dramatic resolution. It was the kind of resolution that 30-year-old situations deserve, quiet and careful, and built on the particular patience that both the people involved had developed over long professional lives of attending to things that required more care than speed. I want to stop here for a moment, because I am aware that what I have just described is a great deal to take in. And I want to say something to you, whoever has stayed with me through this story so far. Has there ever been something in your own family, a kindness extended and never acknowledged, a contribution made in silence, a sacrifice that shaped the lives of people who never knew it was made? That is what I found in those archives. Not a scandal, not a crime. A human being who had quietly done something extraordinarily generous and carried it alone for 30 years. Leave me a comment if any of this is touching something in your own experience. Tell me where you are watching from. I want to know. Subscribe if you have not yet. There is a new story here every single day, and share this one with someone you think might need to hear it. Now let me tell you about the evening in the chapter house, because that is where this story truly ends. The gathering happened on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after my visit to Edmund's house in Prestatyn. Bethan had spoken to Alan the previous weekend in the measured and precise way that Bethan does everything, giving him the essential framework of the situation without the full detail, so that he arrived at the chapter house with an open mind rather than a prepared response. Katrin was there because she deserved to be, because whatever her instinct had told her about the old man in the back pew had been the thing that set this entire unraveling in motion. Edmund arrived with his leather portfolio, wearing the same coat I had seen him in through the cathedral window, and he moved through the ancient room with the careful deliberateness I had observed from a distance, and now recognized as simply the way a man of 81 who has lived seriously moves through the world. The chapter house at St. Asaph Cathedral is one of the smaller medieval chapter houses in Wales, a room of considerable age and quiet dignity, with stone walls that have absorbed the weight of 9 centuries of human decisions made inside them. The oak table at its center is old enough that nobody can say precisely when it was first placed there. The evening prayer service had ended an hour earlier, and the cathedral was quiet around us as we gathered, the particular quiet of a very old sacred space that has recently been full of music and is now resting. We sat at the table, all 5 of us, Edmund and Alan across from each other, with the portfolio between them, Bethan at the corner, Katrin beside me. Edmund opened the portfolio. He took out the drawings and the letters, and he set them carefully on the table in chronological order, the way an archivist would, or a surveyor presenting findings. And then, in the same composed and measured voice I had heard in his kitchen in Prestatyn, he told Alun the full story. I watched my son's face while Edmund spoke. I have known Alan's face for 59 years, and I have seen it in most of the emotional states a human face can occupy, but I had not seen it quite like this before. It was the face of a man receiving information that simultaneously confirmed something he had always intuited and overturned his understanding of its source. He had always known, I think, that his early career had carried an unusual quality of momentum, that doors had opened with a specificity that pure talent alone could not entirely account for. What he had not known was the particular human being who had opened them. He did not interrupt Edmund. He listened with the full and patient attention that is his most characteristic professional quality, the same attention he gives to a bridge assessment or a structural survey, the assumption that the information being presented deserves to be fully received before any response is made. When Edmund finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Alan said, very quietly, "Why did you not tell me at the time?" Edmund looked at the table, then at my son. He said, "Because you were 26 years old and you were trying to begin a career with your own confidence intact. A gift that announces itself is not the same as a gift. I wanted you to walk into that firm knowing that the person who had told them you were worth hiring believed it completely. Which I did. I simply did not want the weight of obligation sitting on your shoulders at the exact moment you needed your hands free. Alan was quiet for another moment. Then he said, 30 years. Edmund said, it was not a burden. It was a choice. I watched something move through my son's face then, something complex and earned, gratitude and grief mixed together in the proportion that 30-year-old things inevitably carry. He reached across the table and he took Edmund's hand, the way a man does who has run out of the right words and understands that the gesture will have to serve instead. Nobody spoke for a while. Katrin, beside me, was looking at Edmund with the expression I now recognized from her description of how he looked at her. Recognition. The understanding of something previously intuited but not named. She said, eventually, "You used to watch me direct and I always felt it was more than watching." Edmund looked at her. He said, "My daughter played for this cathedral for nearly 20 years. She had, I think, something of the same quality you have. The belief that the music and the space are in a conversation with each other and that the director's role is to facilitate that conversation rather than to dominate it. When I watch you work, I see something I thought I would not see again after she died. I did not intend to make you uncomfortable. I apologize if I did." Katrin shook her head. She said, "You did not make me uncomfortable. You made me curious. There is a difference." The documents were donated to the Diocesan Archive at St. Asaph Cathedral the following week, formally received by Mrs. Price with the careful professionalism with which she receives all significant additions to the collection. Edmund Carlisle's name is now properly recorded in the historical account of the 1980s and 90s restoration project, his professional contribution documented alongside his financial contribution, the private arrangement made visible in the archive where history can find it and make what it will of the particular human generosity it represents. 3 weeks after the gathering in the chapter house, Alan drove to Prestatyn and had lunch with Edmund Carlisle at a small restaurant near the seafront, where the Irish Sea was the color of old pewter under a November sky. I know this because Alan told me about it afterward, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, in the careful and emotionally honest way he has always talked to me about the things that have genuinely affected him. He said they talked for nearly 3 hours, not about the documents or the archive or the formal resolution of the historical record. All of that had been addressed in the chapter house. They talked about work, about the specific pleasure of structural assessment, of being the person who walks into a building that has stood for centuries and reads its material truth with trained attention, understanding what it has survived and what it still needs, about the bridges Alan had spent his career restoring and what it meant to him to return years later and see them still standing, about the organ assessments Edmund had done in the early phase of the restoration, including the assessment of the loft where my father had first taught me the interior of a pipe organ, a fact that produced a particular silence between them when Alan mentioned it, the recognition that the connections between their lives ran deeper than either had understood. He said Edmund had asked about me, about what my career had been and where I had worked and what I had built. Alan had told him about the instruments, the churches across the diocese where my work was still functioning, the organ in the small parish at Rill, where my father and I had spent 6 months on a rebuild that I still considered among the best work of my life. He said Edmund had looked out at the sea for a moment after Alan described that particular rebuild. Then he had said, "There are things in every life that last longer than the person who made them. That is not common. It is worth noticing when it is true. I tell you this because it is the part of the story I did not witness directly, and that I therefore must receive second-hand through my son's account of a conversation between 2 men of different generations who had discovered, across an oak table in a medieval chapter house, and then across a restaurant table by the sea, that they had spent their lives devoted to the same essential understanding, that the things human beings build with genuine care and skill deserve to outlast the particular moment in which they were built. Alan also told me, and I include this because it matters to the complete truth of the story, that he had asked Edmund directly whether there was anything that remained undone, any remaining obligation he felt he was owed or that Alan now owed him. Edmund had thought about this for a moment. Then he had said, "Your mother found me. She came to my door, and she sat at my kitchen table, and she told me exactly what she knew and asked me to fill in the rest. That is a remarkable thing for a woman of 79 to do in service of understanding the truth of something. I think she may be the person in this whole situation who has been most consistently doing the right thing. You should tell her that. From me." Alan told me. I am telling you. I include it not because I need the recognition, but because it is part of the accurate record, and I have learned, through this whole investigation, to value accurate records. I want to stop here for just a moment, because I have something to ask you before I reach the end of this story. We are very close to the end now, and I want to know, before we arrive there together, whether this story has given you something you did not have before you pressed play. A question about your own family's history, perhaps. A thought about something that was done for you by someone you never thought to thank, or never knew to thank, because the thing was done quietly and without announcement. Tell me in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what time it is there. And if this old woman's story has meant something to you, please subscribe if you have not already, because there is a new one here every single day, and leave a like, because it matters more than you might think. Share this one if you know someone who might need to hear it. Now let me tell you about the following Sunday, because that is where I want to end. The following Sunday evening was the 1st of December. The cathedral choir had their first proper Advent rehearsal of the year, an occasion that the community tends to mark with some significance because Advent at St. Asaph has a particular quality. The old stone cathedral lit with candles against the December dark, the choir preparing the music that will carry the parish through the weeks toward Christmas, the city gathered around its ancient center point in the way it has been gathering for 9 centuries. It is one of those moments when the continuity of a place becomes fully felt rather than merely understood intellectually. Katrin had invited Edmund, not to observe from the back pew, to sit in the choir stalls. He had apparently been a chorister in his youth, something he had mentioned to Katrin during a brief conversation in the cathedral car park after the chapter house gathering, when she had sought him out specifically to speak to him without the formal context of the family meeting surrounding the exchange. He had not sung in a choir for many decades. He was not certain at 81 that his voice would be of any use to anyone. Katrin had told him that the choir was an adult choir directed by someone who believed that the quality of presence and intention mattered more than the quality of the voice, and that if he wished to sit among them during rehearsal, she would be glad to have him. I arrived to collect Katrin that evening, and I sat in the side aisle where I have sat through more rehearsals and services than I could count over the course of my life in this cathedral. The choir assembled. Katrin stood at the front with the particular calm authority that I have watched develop in her over years of this work, the understanding that her role is to invite rather than to command, to create the conditions in which voices can find each other rather than to impose her own will on the sound. Edmund Carlyle sat in the choir stalls. He had the portfolio with him, as he apparently always did, and he set it carefully under the chair where it fit without obstructing the people beside him. He was given a copy of the music. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of someone who had not held a sheet of choral music in a very long time. Then he looked up at Katrin. She gave them the starting note, and then they sang. I have been listening to music in this cathedral for most of my 79 years. I have heard it in every season and at every hour and under every quality of light that this particular latitude and this particular stone produce in combination. I have heard it in the formal context of services and in the working context of rehearsals and in the private context of a single musician practicing alone when they believed no one was listening. I have heard it when I was very young and when I was not young at all. I have heard it when I was happy, and when I was grieving, and when I was frightened, and when I was simply present in the ordinary way of being alive on an ordinary day. I had never heard it quite like this. It may simply have been the December light, and the candles, and the particular way the stone of that ancient building holds sound in the winter, wrapping it and returning it slightly transformed, with some quality of the building itself added to it. It may have been my own emotional state, the weeks of investigation and conversation and discovery that had preceded this evening. The understanding I now carried of how many quiet acts of generosity had been woven into the history of the place I was sitting in. It may have been the sight of an 81-year-old man singing in a choir for the first time in many decades, his voice not what it once was, but present and committed, and adding itself without self-consciousness to the larger sound around it. Or it may simply have been that some music arrives at the right moment, and that the right moment is not always the one you planned for, but the one you find yourself in after a long and necessary journey. The hymn they sang was the one that had not been finished on the October evening when Katrin had stopped the rehearsal. The hymn she had not been able to sing while Edmund sat watching from the back pew. Katrin had chosen it deliberately for this rehearsal. I recognized it the moment the choir found its opening chord, and I understood why she had chosen it, not as a statement or a gesture, but as a completion. The thing that had been left unfinished, finished. Every voice held steady. The music filled the ancient stone walls the way it has been doing for 9 centuries, finding the spaces between the pillars and rising into the vaulted roof and returning, slightly altered by the stone that had absorbed it and given it back. Edmund sang with his eyes on the page, and then, at some point, with his eyes lifted toward the ceiling, the way singers' eyes go when the music has become sufficiently internalized that the page is no longer necessary. I sat in the side aisle, and I listened, and I thought about all of it. I thought about my father in the organ loft, and the first time I understood from the inside what a pipe organ actually was. Not an instrument, but a building within a building. A construction as structural as the walls around it, converting mechanical force into sacred voice. I thought about Edmund Carlyle writing 2 letters for a young man he believed in, quietly, without announcement, and then carrying the weight of that kindness alone for 30 years. I thought about Bethan turning back to her photographs of a baptismal cloth in her kitchen on an October evening and choosing, for the last time, to maintain a silence she had held for a very long time because she had made a promise to a man she respected, and she intended to keep it until keeping it was no longer the right thing to do. I thought about Katrin stopping a rehearsal because something in her musician's instinct registered a quality in the old man's attention that she could not name, but could not ignore. I thought about the 7 words Bethan had said to me in her kitchen that had set everything in motion. Then it has started again. And I thought about what it means to live long enough to finish the conversations that love left incomplete. Some echoes, I thought, as the music moved through the December air of the oldest cathedral in Wales. Some echoes are not warnings from the past. They are invitations. An old man, sitting in a back pew with a leather portfolio, waiting with the patience of someone who has been waiting a very long time, is not a ghost returning to haunt. He is a conversation waiting to happen. He is a kindness that needs to be received before the person who gave it runs out of time to see it received. The rehearsal ended. The choir gathered their things with the warm and easy familiarity of people who have spent many hours in each other's company in the service of something they all care about. Edmund rose from the choir stalls and collected his portfolio from under the chair and stood for a moment looking at the cathedral interior with the expression of a person taking an inventory of something they love. Katrin went to him. I watched them speak. I could not hear the words from where I sat, but I could see the quality of the exchange. 2 musicians in a sacred space, one at the beginning of her career and one at the very end of his, finding some particular common ground in the shared experience of the music they had just made together. Then Alan and Bethan came in, as they had arranged, and the four of them stood in the nave for a little while. I remained in the side aisle and let them have the space of it, because some conversations do not require a witness, or rather, they require the witness they already have, the 900-year-old stone, the December candlelight, the lingering resonance of the music just finished. Eventually, Katrin looked over and found me in the side aisle and gave me the particular small nod she has given me since she was a girl, to indicate that everything was all right. More than all right. That the thing that had needed to happen had happened, and the world was in better order than it had been before. I put on my coat and walked out through the west door into the December night. The city of St. Asaph lay quiet around the cathedral, in the way small Welsh cities do in winter, the lights of the houses visible on the hillsides, the Elwy Valley dark below, the ancient tower rising above it all, as it has been rising for as long as there have been people in this valley to look up at it. The air was cold and clear, and smelled of the stone and the river and the particular quality of a Welsh winter night that I have never been able to describe to anyone who has not stood in one. I stood for a moment before getting in my car. I thought about Edmund and the leather portfolio. I thought about what it contained and what it had meant and what it would mean now that it had been delivered to the place where it belonged. Not a scandal, not a grievance, a history, accurately recorded, given to the archive where it could be found by anyone patient enough to look. Some things carry themselves for a very long time looking for the right place to be put down. I am glad he found it. I am glad that when he came back to this cathedral and sat in the last pew and waited, there was someone in this family stubborn enough and curious enough to follow the thread until it led somewhere true. I like to think my father would have approved. He believed, as I believe, that the things human beings build with genuine care and skill deserve to be understood accurately. That the history of a building is the history of everyone who contributed to it, not just the ones whose names appear in the formal record. That silence, however kindly intended, is not the same as honor, and that some conversations, however long delayed, are worth every year of the waiting. If you have stayed with me through all of this, I want to say something to you directly. Thank you. Thank you for sitting in this old stone cathedral with me, for following an October investigation through archives and kitchen tables and a small house in Prestatyn, and back to a December rehearsal that finished a hymn that had been waiting to be finished for 2 months. You have given me something by listening, and I want to give you something in return. If there is a kindness in your own history that has never been properly acknowledged, consider whether the person who gave it is still here to receive the acknowledgement. Time moves in one direction only, and it moves with considerable efficiency. If there is someone who did something for you quietly, without announcement, who opened a door without telling you they were the one who opened it, consider whether they know that you know, and whether knowing would matter to them. It mattered to Edmund, not as a debt to be settled, as a truth to be received. And if you are carrying something that belongs elsewhere, some document in a portfolio, some history in a private archive, some kindness done so long ago that you have almost stopped believing it was ever important, consider whether it is time to give it to the place where it belongs. The building is still standing. The archive is still open. History still has room for the accurate record of what people did for one another when no one was watching. Subscribe if you have not already. There is a new story here every single day. Share this one if you think someone you love might need it. And leave me a comment with the word echo, just that one word. Because if you have truly listened to this story, you will understand exactly why that word is the right one. Only the people who paid attention will know. From St. Asaph, from North Wales, from a 79-year-old woman who has spent her life inside the sound of pipe organs and learned, in the end, that the most important music is the kind that finishes what love began. Good night. Take care of each other, each. And when you find an old man sitting quietly in a back pew with a leather portfolio across his knees, do not assume he has nothing to say. Sometimes he has been waiting 30 years to say it, and it was worth the wait.